You know, it's funny how history gets simplified, right? We hear these neat little narratives like, oh yeah, Darwin, he just invented evolution, like it came to him in a dream.
Yeah.
But if you actually go back and read his work in the introduction to On the Origin of Species, he lists out something like 30 other thinkers going back centuries who were already wrestling with these ideas. He even calls them martyrs, intellectual martyrs, because of how risky it was to go against the grain.
Yeah, and it's like those risks weren't just abstract either. I mean, even Darwin's own grandfather, Erasmus Darwin, had faced censorship for exploring similar concepts.
Exactly. And it's not just a Western phenomenon either. Like, centuries before Darwin, in the Muslim world, you have scholars like al-Jahiz,
Right.
exploring concepts of natural selection, adaptation, really foundational ideas.
And the point is, it's never been easy to challenge those deeply held mainstream beliefs. It takes real courage to stand up and say, hold on, what if things aren't quite the way we've always assumed they are?
Which brings us to what we're diving into today, this idea of principled insubordination.
Exactly. And it's not just about being contrary for the sake of it. It's about having a reason, a principle behind your dissent, a desire to see positive change, to push things forward, even if it means ruffling some feathers along the way.
And to really get a handle on this, we've been looking at the work of Todd B, a psychologist who's done a ton of research on resilience, curiosity, well-being.
Yeah, all those qualities that seem to play a big part in how we approach challenges and setbacks.
You're right. And also how we react to ideas that might make us a little uncomfortable, especially those ideas that challenge the way we've always thought about things. And we're really grateful for the translation work of Chen Jiu, who's done a great job making these concepts really accessible.
Absolutely. So for you, our listener, you've shared some really fascinating sources on how to question the status quo and bring in fresh perspectives. And this deep dive is really about unpacking what makes some attempts at dissent successful while others, well, they just kind of hit a wall. What are those strategies that help people navigate the resistance? What can we learn from both the successes and the failures?
So our mission here is pretty clear. We want to dig into these sources, pull out the practical stuff, the actionable insights, and really understand how individuals, you, me, anyone, can speak up effectively and advocate for different points of view, even when it feels like you're going against the tide, right?
Right.
So let's start by tackling this. Why is it so difficult for some people to voice a dissenting opinion while others seem to do it with, well, more ease? What are those psychological blocks, those hurdles that make us resistant to different viewpoints?
You know, one of the biggest things is this human need to belong. It's hardwired into us. I mean, we're social creatures, right? And being part of a group, a tribe, has been essential for survival throughout human history. This tribal thinking, though, can make us prioritize fitting in, going along with the group, sometimes even over logic and reason. Think about it like this. Have you ever noticed how strongly people identify with particular music genres?
Absolutely, yeah.
It's like they almost form tribes around their musical tastes, and they might even dismiss other types of music outright. And that us versus them thinking, it seeps into how we approach ideas too. So we're more likely to reject anything that seems to come from outside our own little intellectual tribe, so to speak.
Yeah, okay, I get that. It's like we have these blinders on and they're preventing us from seeing the bigger picture. And the sources talk about these filters in our brains, these cognitive biases that trip us up in specific ways.
Right, and the sources really break them down into three main categories.
Okay, yeah, let's unpack those
The
categories.
first one has to do with this, again, need to fit in. It's where that in-group bias really comes into play. We naturally favor those in our close circles, the people we identify with. The second set revolves around what's called motivated reasoning. So imagine someone who's a strong supporter of a particular political candidate. Let's say they come across an article praising that candidate. Chances are they'll share it without a second thought. But if they see a news report criticizing the same candidate, even if it's well-sourced, well-researched, they might just dismiss it outright.
Right.
It's like their brain is filtering information to fit their existing beliefs.
Yeah.
That's motivated reasoning in action. And then the third category is all about this need for certainty. It's called motivated certainty. This is where we become overconfident in our own views and fail to see any possible downsides of holding those views too rigidly. It's almost like we trick ourselves into thinking we've got it all figured out.
It's like we're afraid to admit we might be wrong or that there might be another way of looking at things. And these broad categories, they actually manifest in some very specific ways, right? Like these mental shortcuts that our brains take. The sources list out 10 of these cognitive biases that can really seriously cloud our judgment when we're dealing with dissenting opinions.
Yeah.
Can we maybe run through a few of them so our listeners can get a clearer picture?
Sure. Let's start with confirmation bias, which is this tendency to seek out and accept information that already aligns with what we believe. Then there's familiarity bias. This one makes us more comfortable with things we already know. People we already know. It's like sticking to the familiar feels safe. And then there's naive realism, which is a tricky one. It's this belief that we see the world objectively, and anyone who disagrees with us, well, they must just be misinformed or biased, like we have a monopoly on truth. Then there's the illusion of knowledge. This bias tricks us into thinking we know more than we actually do, which can lead us to dismiss valuable input from others. Oh, and then there's the fundamental attribution error. This is where we tend to blame someone's personality for their mistakes. But when we make a mistake, it's because of external factors, not our own fault. We've also got self-consistency bias, which makes us remember our past actions and attitudes as more consistent with our current views than they actually were. Projection bias is another big one. It leads us to assume that other people think and feel the same way we do. Authority bias makes us more likely to accept information coming from authority figures.
Right, so even if that information is questionable, it's like we automatically give more weight to what they say.
Exactly. And then stereotyping bias causes us to make sweeping generalizations about entire groups of people based on limited interactions with a few individuals. It's a recipe for prejudice. And last but not least, we have the bias blind spot. This is kind of ironic. It means we're much better at spotting biases in others than in ourselves, which should be a good reminder that all of us are prone to these mental shortcuts.
Yeah, it's like it's so easy to see the flaws in other people's thinking, but when it comes to our own biases, we have this huge blind spot. So all these biases really highlight how our brains are kind of wired to keep us on this familiar path, even if it means missing out on new perspectives, new information. That could be really valuable. And the sources also point out that our desire for stability, for things to just stay the same, can also make us resistant to dissent.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is where something called status quo bias comes into play. We're naturally inclined to prefer the current situation, even if it's not perfect, even if it's unfair. This bias becomes even stronger when we feel like we have no power to change things. If we believe we have little control over our circumstances, we might actually find comfort in the existing order.
Yeah, it's almost like clinging to the familiar, even if it's flawed.
Exactly. It's a way to cope with a reality that feels unchangeable.
So we avoid rocking the boat because the potential chaos of change is scarier than the status quo. And it's also interesting that the sources point out that even hope, something we usually see as positive, can actually reinforce the status quo. How does that work? I mean, hope's supposed to be a good thing, right?
It is, generally. But here's the catch. If people believe a negative situation is only temporary or that things will eventually get better on their own, they're less likely to take action to change it.
Right?
That hope for a brighter future can sometimes, ironically, lead to complacency. It's almost like they think, well, why bother rocking the boat if things are on track to improve anyway?
So in a way, it's a passive acceptance. It's like hoping for the best without actually doing anything to make it happen.
Yeah.
And this connects to something called system justification theory,
Right.
which is the idea that people who are actually disadvantaged by a system will sometimes defend it. That just seems completely counterintuitive. Why would anyone do that?
It does, on the surface,
Yep.
but there are a lot of factors involved here. As researchers like Dr. Awamalam have pointed out, for those in disadvantaged positions, navigating within the existing system may feel a lot easier than trying to dismantle the whole thing, which is a massive undertaking.
Yeah.
There's also this need for a sense of order, a desire to believe in the security of their current environment, even if it has flaws. And then there's the basic reality of dependence on the system for basic needs like food and shelter and employment. There's actually a great example of this from the 2016 U.S. election.
Okay, yeah, I remember this.
So some Mexican Americans, despite Trump's often really discriminatory rhetoric, still voted for him. And it's like, why? Why would they support someone who seemingly works against their interests? Well, a lot of it has to do with those complex factors we just talked about.
Okay.
For individuals who've built their lives, their families, their careers here in the U.S., the potential disruption that comes with rocking the boat, challenging the system, it can just feel like too much. They might even feel like, okay, I'm experiencing some discrimination, but at least I have some stability within this system. If I try to overturn everything, what will happen to my life? what will happen to my family? Is this fear of the unknown, the fear of making things worse?
So it's a really complicated calculus. It's not as simple as just saying, well, they should oppose anyone who discriminates against them. Their lived experience and their fears factor in, and it's messy. But then the sources also talk about the essential role of those who do push back, those idealistic rebels who challenge the system, who are crucial for progress, even if their methods aren't always perfect or universally loved.
Yeah, these are the people who are willing to say no to authority, to those long-held beliefs that everyone else seems to accept without question. A great example is Elizabeth Jennings. Have you heard of her?
No, I think so.
So, in New York City, decades before Rosa Parks, Elizabeth Jennings refused to give up her seat on a segregated streetcar. Her actions sparked this whole legal battle, a major step towards desegregating public transportation in New York. It was a huge act of defiance. Her story may not be as well known as Rosa Parks's, but her courage, it paved the way.
Yeah, it's so important to remember these often forgotten figures, right? The people who took those initial, incredibly risky steps. It shows us that real change, meaningful change, it often starts with someone saying, enough is enough, this isn't right, and I'm going to do something about it.
Right. And even if we don't agree with every single thing these rebels do, they serve this essential purpose. They force us to re-examine our assumptions, our complacency. They remind us that what we might consider good enough might actually be nowhere near good enough.
Yeah, and it's not just about societal progress either. The sources also talk about how principled insubordination, when done well, can actually lead to more rational thinking on an individual level.
Right.
And can make groups more creative and more productive in the long run.
Absolutely. So we've talked about why dissent can be so hard, and we've talked about why people might resist new ideas. But now let's shift gears a bit. What can we actually do about it? If you have a dissenting view, a different perspective, how can you share it in a way that's more likely to be heard to actually make a difference?
Right, because it's not enough to just have the idea. You have to know how to communicate it, to navigate those biases we talked about earlier. And the sources offer some really fascinating insights from psychology and history, some really practical advice that we can all use.
Right. And a key point here is to understand and address the biases of the people you're talking to.
Yeah.
Remember how Darwin was so aware of the potential controversy surrounding his work?
Yeah.
He deliberately delayed publishing on the origin of species for years, like 15 years.
Oh, that's a long time.
He was really strategic about his timing, about figuring out the best way to present his ideas to minimize that pushback and maximize their chances of being accepted.
Yeah, patience and strategy are key. And it wasn't just about waiting, was it? The way he framed those ideas mattered too.
Absolutely. Framing is huge.
Yeah.
And Darwin did a really smart thing. He used a lot of inclusive language. So instead of saying, I discovered this or I think that, he used we a lot. He brought his readers in, made them feel like they were part of this intellectual journey.
Right.
So it didn't feel like this confrontational lecture. It felt like a shared exploration.
Yeah, that makes sense. And the sources also really stress the importance of having strong allies, what they call sanghu.
Oh, yeah. Having the right people in your corner can make all the difference. Like Darwin had this whole network of respected scientists.
Like who?
Well, folks like Charles Lyell, Joseph Hooker, Asa Gray, and of course Thomas Henry Huxley. He became known as Darwin's bulldog because he was so fiercely supportive of Darwin's ideas. And it's interesting because when Alfred Russel Wallace, the guy who independently came up with a very similar theory of evolution, sent Darwin his manuscript, it actually spurred Darwin to finally publish his own work. But neither Darwin nor Wallace were actually present at the big public meeting, where those groundbreaking ideas were first presented to the scientific community.
Oh, wow.
It was Darwin's allies, those influential scientists, who championed their work, who used their standing to vouch for the credibility of Darwin's research, especially since Darwin had all these meticulously documented notes dating back years. And this really drives home the point that the acceptance of an idea isn't just about the idea itself. It's about those social dynamics. It's about having respected figures who are willing to stand up and say, hey, this is important. This is worth listening to.
So it's like even the most brilliant idea needs the right kind of support to actually take root and grow.
Exactly.
The sources also outline some essential skills for effective dissent. They call them offyu.
Yes.
The first one is be curious, not furious. And I love that framing.
It's so important to approach those challenges with an open mind. Think about the band Fugazi. They had all this, confusion, anger, even anxiety about those pressures to conform, those aspects of mainstream culture they just didn't jive with. But instead of just lashing out, they channeled those feelings into their music.
Right.
And that genuine curiosity, it really resonated with a huge audience.
Yeah.
And it wasn't just about the music itself. They really carved out this unique path, driven by their artistic exploration, not just chasing commercial success. And in doing so, they had this huge impact, not just on punk music, but on countless other artists too.
Yeah, it's a great example of turning potentially negative emotions into something really creative and thought-provoking. And it goes beyond just music. This applies to any kind of dissenting view, right? Channel that energy into exploring the issue, into understanding different perspectives. The second, Wookiee, is make the audience curious, not afraid. And this really gets to the heart of communication, right?
Right, you can have the most brilliant idea in the world, but if you present it in a way that makes people feel threatened or like you're attacking them, they're going to shut down. There's actually this tragic example from medical history, the story of Dr. Ignaz Semmelweis.
Okay.
So way back before germ theory was widely accepted, Semmelweis discovered this crucial link between hand washing and preventing something called puerperal fever. It was basically childbed fever, a really dangerous infection that women were getting in hospitals after childbirth. He had all this data showing that when doctors washed their hands with this chlorine solution after doing autopsies and before delivering babies, the death rate plummeted.
Wow.
But the problem was, he presented his findings in a really aggressive, accusatory way. He was basically saying, you doctors, you're killing your patients with your dirty hands.
Oh, wow.
Which, I mean, he was right, but his approach completely alienated the medical community. And because of that, they resisted his findings, even though they could have saved countless lives. It's a stark reminder that scaring people or putting them on the defensive is not an effective way to introduce new ideas.
It's like a cautionary tale.
Yeah.
Even when you have the facts on your side, if you don't present them with empathy and tact, people will just tune you out. It's all about how you make people feel.
Exactly.
The third essential skill for effective dissent is cultivate intellectual humility.
Right.
And this seems especially relevant today when everyone seems so dug into their own positions.
Right. Absolutely. Admitting that you don't know everything, that you might be wrong, it can actually make your message more persuasive. It shows that you're open to learning, which makes people more willing to listen to you. There's actually research showing that expressing uncertainty, when it's genuine, can actually boost your credibility.
Yeah.
And it's such a contrast to that whole say whatever you want, just be confident approach that's become so prevalent. This source uses Jordan Peterson as an example of how that approach, that unwavering certainty, can actually backfire. But the core principle here is that intellectual humility opens the door for genuine dialogue and learning, whereas arrogance just shuts those doors.
Right. It's about being open to being wrong. It's about recognizing that we all have blind spots and that learning and growth come from acknowledging those blind spots.
Exactly.
And the final essential skill is find the right allies for self-expansion. And this sounds like it's about more than just finding people who agree with you.
It is. It's about finding allies who challenge you, who push you to think more deeply, to expand your understanding. Do they offer different perspectives? Do they question your assumptions in a way that's constructive? Do they support your personal growth, your intellectual growth? Those are the things to look for in an ally, not just their status or their power. It's about actively seeking out relationships with people who see things differently than you do. Engaging with diverse sources of information like books, documentaries, podcasts. All of these things contribute to what's called self-expansion, which strengthens your ability to effectively question the status quo. And it's not just about intellectual expansion either. It's about emotional expansion. The concept of emotionships is really important here.
Emotionship?
Yeah, it's a bit of a mouthful. Basically, it means relationships where you feel safe to regulate your emotions, where you feel truly supported. Supportive allies, they offer care, protection, understanding. They celebrate your successes, and they're there for you during those inevitable setbacks. Even going through hardship together, it can forge these really powerful bonds of trust.
Yeah.
So finding the right allies, it's not just about having a cheering section. It's about having people who help you become a more thoughtful, more well-rounded person, who help you grow.
Okay, so we've covered individual strategies for making your dissenting voice heard, but now let's zoom out a little and think about creating an environment, whether it's a team at work, a classroom, a whole organization where diverse perspectives are actually valued and encouraged. How do you cultivate a culture that's truly open to dissenting views?
Yeah, it takes a real conscious effort to build that kind of environment. It has to be intentional. First, you have to actively seek out a variety of perspectives. Don't just surround yourself with people who think like you. And don't just pay lip service to diversity. Actually value contributions that offer something different. Encourage a mindset where team members are constantly thinking about how their views might differ from the majority. And it can be as simple as asking, hey, how does your perspective on this differ from the group's? Even small, visible gestures of deviance, little ways of signaling individuality, can help break down that pressure to conform.
Yeah, it's about creating space for those differences to emerge and be valued. It reminds me of that example in the source about the interracial kiss on Star Trek.
Yeah, that was a pretty big deal back in 1968. Captain Kirk kissing Lieutenant Uhura. It was the first interracial kiss on American television.
Wow.
And it happened during this incredibly tense time for civil rights in the U.S. Interracial marriage had just been legalized nationwide the year before.
Right.
So the controversy was huge. And what's really inspiring is the courage of the actors, William Shatner and Nichelle Nichols, because they faced a ton of pressure to back down, but they stood their ground. And it's a beautiful example of allyship, too, because Nichols actually considered leaving the show, but Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. himself encouraged her to stay.
Wow, really?
Yeah, he recognized the profound impact of her representation on screen, how it challenged those harmful stereotypes. And it shows that sometimes the most powerful allies come from unexpected places.
Yeah, and this leads into the idea of building unexpected alliances, which the source illustrates with a great story Marty Goddard and Hugh Hefner.
Oh, yeah, that's a great one. So Marty Goddard was this incredible advocate for sexual assault victims. And she was trying to get funding and resources for this rape kit initiative, to collect evidence after an assault. But she was hitting all these roadblocks. And then, of all people, Hugh Hefner, the founder of Playboy, stepped in and offered her a huge donation through the Playboy Foundation.
Wow.
And not just money, they gave her office space, too.
So she accepted support from an organization that some people considered to be, part of the problem.
Exactly. And she got a lot of criticism for it, especially from some feminist groups. But her main goal was to help survivors.
And she was willing to work with anyone who could make that happen.
Right. And by the late 1970s, her kits were being used in tons of hospitals in the Chicago area. And by 1980, nationwide. It shows that sometimes you have to prioritize the goal over ideological purity. And sometimes the most effective alliances come from the most unexpected places.
Yeah, it's a powerful reminder that sometimes progress requires pragmatism. It requires setting aside those preconceived notions of who's on your side and who isn't, and focusing on the shared goal. It's about getting things done. Now, being a dissenter, a principled insubordinate, it can be tough emotionally. I mean, you're facing pushback, you're challenging norms, you're putting yourself out there. So what strategies does the source suggest for building that resilience, that ability to bounce back from those inevitable setbacks?
Yeah, it's not easy, but it is possible. And one of the key things is developing what's called psychological flexibility. It's this ability to bounce back from challenges, to adapt to difficult situations without getting stuck in those negative thought loops.
Okay.
The source outlines this really practical key 4-steps approach to building resilience. Step 1 is clarify your mission. Connect those actions, those dissenting actions, to your core values. What do you truly believe in? Why are you doing this? Step 2 is acknowledge your distress. Don't try to suppress those negative emotions. Just let yourself feel them.
Yeah, because trying to bottle those emotions up, it usually just makes things worse.
Right. Step 3 is note your typical unhelpful responses to distress. So do you tend to withdraw? Do you lash out? Do you get stuck in self-criticism? Just notice those patterns without judgment. And then step 4 is consider actions that would genuinely increase your chances of success in the long run.
Okay, so it's about being proactive. It's not just about weathering the storm. It's about figuring out how to move forward, even when things are tough.
Exactly. And the source also emphasizes the importance of facing your emotions head on. Don't try to ignore them or pretend they're not there. There's this technique called emotional labeling, which is really simple but surprisingly effective. Just name your emotions. So if you're feeling anxious, say to yourself, okay, I'm feeling anxious right now. It sounds almost too easy. But research shows that people who are good at labeling their emotions are actually less likely to engage in unhealthy coping mechanisms, like excessive drinking or lashing out at others, and they're better at handling rejection. There's also this technique called cognitive diffusion, which is about creating some separation between you and your thoughts.
So it's not about denying your thoughts, but it's about recognizing that they're just thoughts. They don't define you.
Exactly. It's about observing them without getting caught up in them. And when it comes to making tough decisions, perspective taking can be super helpful. So try to imagine your situation from a distance. Or even better, try to see it from the perspective of someone you admire, someone whose judgment you trust.
Yeah, it's like getting outside your own head for a minute and looking at the situation with fresh eyes.
Exactly. And even using third-person self-talk, so referring to yourself by your name, can create that helpful distance. And here's a tip. Sharing your goals with people you respect can actually boost your commitment. It taps into our desire to make a good impression on those we admire.
Right, so it's like we're more likely to follow through if we know someone we respect is watching. And it's important to prepare for obstacles, right?
Absolutely.
Both those internal doubts and the external resistance. I mean, think about historical figures who are imprisoned for their beliefs. It's very likely they anticipated those challenges and prepared themselves mentally and emotionally. They had this three-part approach to principled insubordination. First, know your purpose. Second, manage your distress. And third, build your resilience to increase those chances of success. So far, we've explored the challenges of dissenting, effective strategies for voicing those dissenting views, and building those more inclusive environments. But what happens when those who were once the rebels, the outsiders, actually become the new mainstream? What new challenges do they face when the tables turn?
It's interesting because that shift from outsider to insider, it brings a whole new set of complexities. Take the example of Evo Morales in Bolivia. He rose from poverty to become president. But eventually, he faced so much public criticism and pressure that he ended up stepping down.
Right.
His story really highlights the difficulties of holding on to those original ideals when you're the one in power.
Right.
And there's this thing called rebel's discontent.
Rebels' discontent.
Yeah,
Okay.
it's this lingering feeling of alienation from the mainstream, even after achieving success, which can make it really tough to unite a diverse population. It's like that underdog identity becomes so ingrained that it's almost impossible to fully embrace being in a position of authority, even if you fought hard to get there. And then there's the risk of replicating the very behaviors you once opposed. Martin Luther King Jr. had that powerful warning that if we can't learn to live together as brothers, we will perish together as fools. That's incredibly relevant here. Those same psychological mechanisms that drive tribalism, they can lead those who are now in power to turn on the former mainstream, to treat them with the same aggression and hostility they once experienced.
Right. So it's like this cycle of oppression where the oppressed become the oppressors. So how do we break that cycle?
It's about staying humble, staying open-minded. Even after you've achieved success, keep listening to diverse perspectives, including criticism. And remember, those who were once the dissenting voices, they need to be especially vigilant about this.
So it's about not letting power corrupt you. It's about holding on to those principles that drove you to dissent in the first place. And the sources also talk about the role of humor in challenging mainstream thinking, even when you're the one who's now part of the establishment.
Yeah, humor and gentle mockery can be a great way to question those established norms. But it has to come from a place of good faith, a genuine desire to offer a different perspective.
Like Stephen Colbert's roast of President George W. Bush at the White House Correspondents' Dinner.
Exactly. But the key here is avoiding hypocrisy. You have to be willing to apply the same standards of critique to your own group that you applied to the former mainstream. A society thrives on a diversity of viewpoints, and that includes the ability to laugh at ourselves, even within our own tribe.
Yeah, it's about being able to take a joke, even when it's directed at you, even when it makes you a little uncomfortable.
Right.
Okay, so to wrap things up, let's think about how we can encourage the spirit of principled insubordination in others, particularly in children. How do we raise the next generation of thoughtful dissenters?
Yeah, it's about nurturing that courage to speak up, to challenge what they see as wrong. And there's this incredible story. It really highlights the bravery it takes.
Yeah, okay.
So Cheryl Kennedy, she was a whistleblower at the University of Buffalo.
Right.
She risked her entire career to expose potential academic fraud by her supervisor, this guy named William Falls Stewart. It was huge. And it's important to remember that dissenting voices, they can create this sense of anxious uncertainty in others because they're challenging established beliefs. They're disrupting that comfortable order that people rely on. So how do we overcome that resistance?
Right.
Well, presenting new ideas in smaller steps can help. Avoid overwhelming people with too much change all at once. Highlighting those areas of agreement, shared values, before introducing those dissenting views is important. And framing dissent as a way to improve the existing system, not to destroy it, is crucial. And of course, consistently advocating for that dissenting view, even if it takes time, is key.
Yeah, persistence is so important. It's about staying true to your principles, even when it's hard. And what about those in positions of authority? What can they do to foster this culture of dissent?
They have to be open to learning. They have to be willing to consider those perspectives that challenge their own. Intellectual humility is so important, especially for leaders. There's this concept called epistemic motivation. It's this strong desire to really understand things thoroughly, to dig deep, to ask questions. And teams and individuals with high epistemic motivation, they're much more receptive to internal dissent. They're better problem solvers. They're more innovative. And there's actually research showing that simply reflecting on those qualities that promote knowledge seeking actually increases acceptance of dissent.
So it's about fostering this curiosity. It's about being willing to be proven wrong.
Right. And
Yeah.
humility is a huge part of creating this learning-oriented culture where disagreements are seen as opportunities to grow. And it's important to remember that it's not just about seeking knowledge for knowledge's sake. It's about using that knowledge to benefit the group, to do good, combining epistemic motivation with this pro-social orientation, this desire to make things better for everyone. That's the sweet spot.
And what about those dynamics within groups? Because groups can sometimes form these little subgroups that can actually stifle dissent.
Yeah, breaking down those cliques and in-groups is crucial. And using debiasing strategies can really help. So actively seek out viewpoints from people with different backgrounds, different experiences. Make a conscious